Welcome back to this final session. This is a very challenging session because this is a drowsy time after a very good lunch. But also secondly, because this is the end of 2 days of very fascinating panels with great discussion and rigorous discussion. So although we are a smaller audience, let's make it a climax, a good ending. Well, we are very honored and I'm very happy to be the chair, as we have very good speakers. And it is very amazing, I told Mr. Blumeke, it's very amazing how he connects all of us together. So this is a post-colonial connections. It's amazing because we can see later on how one paper will resonate with one another. It's not one paper and then the two commentators, but actually one engagement and the other, connect to the previous paper, how it resonates with their position and their localities. So I would like to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Laymert Garcia dos Santos. He is a renowned essayist and also a former lecturer in the field of sociology of technology at the University of Campinas, Sao Paulo. He has written extensively on various topics, but most importantly, he would share with us later on his experience in an artistic production and a conception of the multimedia opera project for the Munich Biennale Opera of 2000. And he would kindly show to us an excerpt of the film that he produced, an experimental film of Yanomami Shamanism. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melani. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. When I was invited to this meeting, I was told that the intent was not a scholars' debate, but instead how speakers and respondents have been dealing with post-colonialism. That's why I chose to focus on what one could call the Brazilian experience on a decolonizing process as state policy. Yesterday, I was very pleased to listening Divya Dwivedi critique on post-colonialism. I agree with her. And to go straight to the point, I would say that for me, post-colonialism is the way neo-colonialism is trying to reinvent colonialism in the age of the second globalization. Having said that, let me read the paper I wrote, and please be indulgent with my broken English. I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Heinrich Blumek's invitation to participate in this panel discussion in post-colonial perspectives. The topic of this meeting is absolutely contemporary due to the geopolitical shifts taking place nowadays after the displacement towards a multipolar world in which the Asian continent has an increasing importance. That's why I'm really happy to come to Indonesia and listen how you are dealing with the perspective shifts. I've come from South America, more specifically from Brazil. I might say that our continent had an important post-colonial experience from the 80s on, when several South American nations managed to replace dictatorship regimes with democracy. This experience implied, above all, the inclusion of marginalized groups of the national population left behind. It gave place to the elaboration of new constitutions in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, and Argentina. Several South American countries did recognize the rights of traditional population, especially indigenous peoples and Afro-Americans, right to demarcation and preservation of their territories, right to their own culture and knowledge. Some of these countries became constitutionally multi-diverse, pluri-ethnic, and pluricultural. Along with the increasing importance of the environmental issue in the continental and international political contexts, in the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century, the presence, the voice, and discourse of diversity expanded significantly. Such expansion can, of course, be understood as a post-colonial trend. Diversity implied the statement of those people's singularities and differences in relation to Eurocentric, Euro-American, Western narratives. They had associated protection of traditional culture and knowledge with defense of an environment threatened by fast deterioration. In Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and also in Brazil, the role of ancient cultures were reconsidered to criticize the development model imposed from outside in. However, it's necessary to point out that the eruption of those populations in the political and cultural landscape did not mean any regression nor a pre-modern anachronism, as local elites would think. In fact, in all South American continent, there were claims for different ways of being contemporary, to deal with contemporary contexts and problems. As a matter of fact, it was not about going back to the past, but indeed to build up a different future from the one that had been intended by colonialism and neocolonialism. In this regard, the so-called post-colonial outlines defined by Western scholars does not correspond to the new narratives, since these ones are based on other references, other parameters, other logics, other ontologies, other epistemologies. For more than 3 decades, the fight for recognition of ethnic and cultural diversity have been changing our understanding of our own countries. New cultural perspectives spread out, and main cities were no longer the unique sources of artistic and cultural production. The exchange amongst the South American countries increased substantially, and Brazil began to turn within and to its neighbors. The creation of music, dance, fine arts, cuisine, and design started to reflect the cultural richness and complexity which had been underestimated. The new move took place in popular production as well as in high and digital cultures. This is why the Goethe-Institut São Paulo initiative to start a South-South dialogue was pretty welcomed in several South American countries. One might say that our countries were discovered or rediscovered. Yet this movement was at the same time, cause and consequence of changes brought by new inclusion-oriented democratizing state policies. Let's take Brazil's case during the years 2003 to 2016, period in which we had progressive, democratic, and popular governments. The Brazilian elite usually takes culture in 2 different ways. High culture is a luxury good and as such a matter of distinction. Mass culture is a commodity according to the logic of entertainment. The successive administrations always dealt with Brazilian culture in this way, before Lula's government. That's why, since its foundation in 1985, the Ministry of Culture was irrelevant. In order to have governmental cultural policies in pair with Brazilian people's richness, diversity, and inventiveness, the country had to wait for the election of a factory worker as president. Lula appointed then a black mestizo, singer and composer Gilberto Gil, as Minister of Culture. It seems that the colonized Brazilian elite could not recognize the strategic importance of culture to nation building. Gilberto Gil's speech at the inauguration as Minister of Culture on January 2003 shows it was the onset of a new era. Dismissing the dominant conceptions, Gil put culture in a higher dimension. And if it hadn't been clearly understood at the time by all sectors of Brazilian society, it was because people could not fully grasp the deep decolonizing cultural policies process. Gil argued it was his duty, quotation, to bring the Ministry of Culture closer to the Brazilian people's daily life, end of quotation. Brazilian people came out of three major ethnic matrices: the Portuguese colonizers, the African-born slaves, and the indigenous peoples. Drawing on anthropological concepts of culture, which recognize the mix of these three matrices, Gil focused on our unique way of producing knowledge and know-how, on our gestures, on our manners. To him, culture was, quotation, the people's factory of symbols. And that's why he thought of a ministry shedding light in past and present, in things and signs, which led Brazil to be Brazil. Gil's strategy was to confront the central paradox of cultural issues in Brazil: a people whose creativity is boundless, but has no access to the cultural production. A people who has never been to cinema, theater, and exhibitions, but at the same time, the very people who created the Samba School, which is called the School of Life, this fantastic street opera staged by millions of people in Rio de Janeiro, who turn misery into wealth, lack into abundance, and negativity into affirmation. Facing this paradox, Gil raised a question: what would a creative people do if they knew their real value was recognized and supported? Neither the state nor the market had ever asked this question before. So, during the first years under Lula's administration, it was necessary to design a state cultural strategy, a set of public policies that would make the Ministry of Culture an institution capable of mobilizing the existing cultural forces in the country, instead of serving as a mere public funds distributor to the private sector in the old patronage methods. It was necessary to devise a broad diagnosis of the production conditions, of the access to cultural goods all over the country, to identify cultural operators' deficiencies and major bottlenecks, and to review the existing laws and regulations. It was also necessary to take into account non-official artistic manifestations, forms of expressions from the outskirts, like graffiti art, funk, and hip-hop music, and to open venues for the young, as well as the marginalized traditional and quilombola communities. The aim was to link the strength of cultural diversity and the potentials of digital culture. It was necessary to open a national public debate on culture in Brazil through the National Committee on Cultural Policies. It was necessary to foster research on contemporary issues and the role of new technologies by opening public notices aimed at financing new projects, experimental projects. It was necessary to restructure museums to fund archaeology, to rethink cinema and theater sponsoring, to reassess the role of fine arts, to find a solution to prevent the closure of São Paulo Biennial. In short, the Ministry of Culture focused in the conception and implementation of a cultural agenda as part of a general project for the building of contemporary Brazil as a nation, claiming its place in the globalized world through its singularity. One should stress that from the very beginning of the popular government, the strategy of the Ministry of Culture has always been aligned with the new agenda of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This was a very successful effort that made Brazil an influential country in global geopolitics through soft power. That's why the ministry had a central role in the UNESCO's Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, and also why the Year of Brazil was held in many different countries during this period. The new agenda was sharply criticized by the conservatives. They accused the ministry of state dirigism and authoritarianism, of threatening freedom of expression and free enterprise. They systematically ignored the democratic nature of the proposal, whose intent was to promote a better distribution of public funds and also to fight against its exclusion and cultural concentration in Brazil. Of all initiatives of this paradigm shift, the most original and promising was the creation of 2,500 cultural spots program, which took place all over Brazil. These were the venues in which young people had access to digital media, aiming cultural production, fruition, and experimentation. 8 million people were connected to those centers. Another important project was the mobile broadband expansion to 125 million people. The Culture Spots project was crucial for the ministry strategy since they were designed to link culture and technology. We were used to the idea that modern and contemporary development models should reproduce the way Euro-American logics relate culture and technology. However, in the scope of BRICS, China and India were showing to us other possibilities. Chinese and Indians have dealt at the same time with modern Western logic and their traditional logic to put their cultural development forward in a technological geostrategic position. Brazilians were trying to explore their own way. Nevertheless, all this strategy of cultural decolonizing policies began to be dismantled after President Dilma Rousseff's government crisis and her impeachment in April 2016. The coup, which had the active participation of the most conservative sectors of the judiciary, the army, media, and elite, resulted in the 2018 presidential election. Ex-President Lula's favorite candidate was persecuted and arrested by means of lawfare and then barred from elections. Consented election fraud, a massive amount of fake news, and army intervention ensured the victory and the ascension to power of far-right forces with fascist traits. In conclusion, there is no longer rule of law in Brazil. Democracy was shot in its very core. From this perspective, a post-colonial cultural strategy had to be quickly wiped out. And that's what is happening in Brazil, with the rising of violence against indigenous peoples, Afro-Americans, the LGBT community, and the marginalized populations at the same time where labor laws are being revoked. The Ministry of Culture has just been extinguished. Cultural diversity is under attack, and arts, even textbooks, are being censored. Before I finish my talk, I would like to mention briefly how all this process has affected my own work. From 2006 to 2010, I was engaged in the concept of a transcultural project. I say transcultural, not multicultural or even intercultural. Transcultural, and I'll explain why. The creation of a multimedia opera for the Munich Biennial for Theater Music. The initiative stemmed from the biennial, the Goethe-Institut, and in collaboration with ZKM from Karlsruhe, a Center of Art and Technology, and also SESC, Brazilian Cultural Institution. The idea was to present to contemporary opera audience a vision of the Amazon deforestation through a double perspective. The Western techno-scientific perspective that sees the rainforest from outside in, and the Yanomami shaman perspective that sees the forest from inside out. The Yanomami, Brazilian, and European artists and technicians worked together on the challenge to confront ontological and epistemological differences important for the dialogue, and bearing in mind that the Western thinking should not be considered superior to the indigenous people's magical thinking. It was a fascinating experimentation that resulted in performances in Munich and in São Paulo in 2010 and in Vienna in 2013. During the work process, Brazilians and Europeans realized that the Yanomami shamanism consisted of a practice founded on its own technology to access highly sophisticated virtual worlds. Shamanism can also be perceived as a contemporary technology. In other words, beyond any prejudice, one has to conceive contemporaneity as plural and diverse, with logics that perhaps could be positively articulated instead of being opposed in an excluding manner. The 4-year experiment touched me deeply, so I decided to explore the issue a little bit further when I had the opportunity to make the film Chapiri to show a great shamans meeting in a Yanomami village in the heart of Amazon rainforest. Our team didn't want to make a realistic film, a documentary, neither an anthropological film. We expected to involve the spectator in the Yanomami's rituals. In fact, we had a paradoxical issue to deal with. To make a film about something that only the shamans can see, the spirits Chapiripe. How then could we show something we can't actually see? Based on the anthropological knowledge and on what the shamans themselves had told us, we learned shamanism had its own audiovisual image generation technology that would perhaps resonate with the Western digital technology. What is the image in Yanomami shamanism? The anthropologist Bruce Albert writes, I quote, "The images utupe that the Yanomami shamans invoke, bring down, and make dance in a dream or a trance are the ancestral human animals that lived in the times of the origins. It is said that such images constituted the specter value of the primordial beings endowed with a human skin, body, and with an animal name, identity. They are perceived by the shamans in the form of an infinite multiplicity of tiny humanoids decorated with body paintings and dazzling bright ornaments. Such corpuscular image beings, a sort of mythological quanta, inhabited the world in a free state, caught up in a ceaseless activity of games, exchanges, and wars that sustain the dynamics of the visible phenomena. Once installed during the initiation in a celestial dwelling associated with the young shaman, they become his sons, a kindred form of humanimal images of the first time. They are then, according to the ethnographic jargon, auxiliary spirits, Chapiripe. Once the Chapiripe are tamed in this way, they are selected and combined in each shamanic session according to their attributes and skills. In the understanding of Bruce Albert, this mode of the fundamental image being constitutes the center of gravity of Yanomami ontological and cosmological thought. The anthropologist also points out that the shamanic images dreamed out or induced by hallucinations should not be classified as what we call mental images, mirages, inner visions, since they are described by the shamans as direct perceptions of an outer, absolutely tangible world. On the other hand, Bruce Albert states, quote again, this does not involve a phenomenon of representation, but rather a process of the presentification of the invisible. Neither replicas nor metaphors, the Utupe images are above all ontological states whose intermittent visibility is made effective during the shamanic session by an effect of corporal transduction. Therefore, the film Chapiri was structured to allow the spectator to step gradually into the shaman's ritual. It started with the arrival in the village Watoriki, when the spectator discovered the Yanomami. It is a people from a different world whose prevalent color is red. And then the spectator watched the shaman's preparations, body painting, inhaling of yakoana. They embark on dancing and calling for the Chapiripe. It follows a set of portraits stressing the beauty of ornaments, the character and expressive power of each shaman, but also the eruption of their auxiliary spirits, flickering points of light that burst out of the forest to lodge themselves in the shaman's chest. For the soundtrack, we used chants throughout the film which either correspond or not to the images. The ritual continues to deepen, the atmosphere changes, a new round of hallucinogens suggests that the process intensifies, up to the moment in which chants and dances announce and perform the passage of Chapiripe in the shaman's bodies. A long sense with the powerful shaman Levity shows him getting rid of his adornments and handing them over to his fellows as a sign that his auxiliary spirits are about to leave. We are back to the village's daily life, to its people and its continuity in the future through the boys' game. This last paragraph is just to tell you what you will see, a 6 minute, a kind of a video clip of a film of 54 minutes, just to have an idea of how we try to manage in conceptual terms the relationship between shamans technology, audiovisual shamans technology, and Western digital technology. Thank you.
シャボの裏やいてばだかうおぶりウェイナソニハヘブラブシャボのぶシャボの裏はばだぼこだとどばるれ
はい、はい。はい、はい。キーあロロロロロロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケーあロロロロロロロロロケーあロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロケロkita tuh ada yang kiri khi yo em thấy à hồi đây bự ta quỳ khi mình bên đó hả bắt thấy à amo à hồi xem đi đi nhặt nhặt thấy à đi đi bộ đi yo ha mà mau nè khi à ya rồi hơ à khi nè đi vào ami thôi bự đi bự ham amo nhặt thấy amo à ha đi à cứ nè em nó đi vào ya nhặt thấy nó ha ya nó con nó đi vào ami thơ mà đã cứ nè đi vào ami ya đi ha tham à nè nè em nó ha thơ à cu ya ya lên thế đi thơ cu đi thế nè thơ mò đi mà kỳ ha ya thơ à đi khi yo à cu mày à mò đi mày ba bự ya hết thơ và hết là yo nó ya nó mà hết rồi mày kỳ thế quay yo bự hết rồi quay ha màu nè à chào ăn nó
at the moment we stopped, it was when they are still calling the spirits to come in to their chests. And what was shown afterwards was how the auxiliary humanimal spirits appear in the shaman's body through dance. And it was, 3 minutes, something. It's not important. The importance is only I chose this sequence only to pose this issue that we can consider how traditional knowledge can be put in dialogue with Western knowledge, mainly techno-scientific knowledge, in a non-asymmetric position. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laymert. Actually, in the ending of the shaman ritual, you can see how it's different from the Orientalist kind of anthropological documentary. You can see how the shaman look at you instead of, returning the gaze to you, and then when she finished the ritual, just taking off all the instrument, the buds, and give it to as if giving to the audience, Very, very beautiful ending in which it's just like a dialogue rather than us looking at the shaman. Okay, now we will have some responses from two very prominent figures in Indonesia. You all, the Indonesian, you should know about them. Ayu Utami, she entered the literary scene. She was a reporter before, a journalist, and also was later on very active in journalist activism, independent journalist activism. When she first enters the literary scene, it was in 1998. I remember it was during the riot, the May 12, actually, 13 or 12, 13, yeah? May 13. It was the launch of her first novel, Saman, a novel who is actually debunking or criticizing the New Order. It was the exact time when the New Order was falling apart, and it was the time of the riot. So when we returned from the launch, actually the street was very quiet. We don't know that actually it was the time of the riot. After that, she went on and did a lot of other novels, and she would share with us her perspective about what already mentioned, the key issue about other epistemologies, local cultural expressions. So now it's time.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We are thankful for Laymert's presentation. The situation he describes and the proposal he suggests are indeed very relevant to Indonesia and many Southeast Asian countries which have indigenous societies being marginalized by modern civilization on one side, and on the other side can still search from within these indigenous epistemologies elements to develop as alternatives source for emancipation in this post-colonial global capitalistic world. For me, emancipation is a key word. We'll always measure things based on its emancipative value. There are many relevant comparisons can be made between Indonesia and what Laymert have present. For example, about the cultural strategy from the Minister of Culture, which I think we are now having. But I have to limit myself and focus myself, and I'm not going to talk about the cultural strategy of the government. I want instead to underline three interesting key thoughts from the presentation and give a short comparison of Indonesia situation. The first, when we usually refer to the post-Western colonialism, when we talk about post-colonialism, actually we are thinking about colonialism by the West, which usually start, this post-colonial process usually start after the end of the World War, that is in the 1940s. Laymert points instead to the post-colonial situation after the replacement of military regime with democracy, that is in the 80s in Brazil and in South America, I'm sorry. And this is, I think, a very interesting and important point of view. There is a switch of focus from the inter-nations colonialism to the colonialism within a nation state. This switch of focus enables us to see different levels of situation and free ourselves from the trap of patriotism. I think the problem with being obsessed to the Western colonialism is that we are trapped into the patriotic sentiment. And the similar situation that we saw in the film, unfortunately, it is not finished, yeah. But the similar situation can also happen in Indonesia. Of course, we don't do the same approach making the film, but the problems of indigenous situation, rituals can also be seen in Indonesia, where many indigenous people are marginalized by modern civilization. Some of you may ask questions about the usage of indigenous here, but for the time being, we accept that we don't want to go to details about the definition of indigenous people. That's the first, colonialism within a nation state. The second point, since the 80s, for more than 3 decades now, the Brazilian culture is being discovered and rediscovered. This I quote from his presentation. The fight for recognition of ethnical and cultural diversity have been changing the understanding of the country. And here again, I think it is very interesting. We don't see European perspective as the only point of reference anymore. It doesn't seek for a Portuguese identity, even though Brazil was the colony of Portugal for decades, for centuries, I'm sorry. Laymert used term pluricultures and pluriethnics as the new identity of Brazil. And this reminds me of a friend, a writer from Brazil who was with a German descendant with blonde hair, white skin, blue eyes, but he said he passed away, I'm sorry. He was the priest of Umbanda religion. Umbanda religion is a kind of syncretism between African, Indian, and Native Indian or Indian American and Christianity. So I found it very interesting that this could happen in Brazil. It cannot happen in Indonesia anymore. I mean, this syncretism of monotheism and other local or spiritualities. What is the comparable situation in Indonesia? As we know, Indonesia's military regime was replaced by democracy in the beginning of the 2000 era, 20 years behind Brazil. Unfortunately, what we have here now is not the pluricultures. We used to campaign about kebinekaan or plurality, but now what we have rising is local ethnocentrism and religious intolerance and radicalism. The third point is that there is a need not to be dependent on Western logic alone, but developed our traditional logic in parallel, or indigenous epistemology. And I share similar concern with Laymert, especially in my novel Bilangan Fu, or The Number Fu, and its series, which deal with the story of destruction of the environment and the marginalization of local spirituality. This novel describes three entities that cause the trouble in our world today. The unholy trinity is a triple M: militarism, modernity, and monotheism. I wrote this slightly before the rise of Hindu chauvinism revival in India went to the international media. So this writing was from 10 years ago. This unholy trinity of the triple M, militarism, modernity, and monotheism, is what I find need to be deconstructed or criticized, at least in Indonesia, but I think also in the world. Militarism serves as the physical enforcement. It is an ideology of violence without any distinctive value or content. Modernity serves as the substructure through market economy and the technological advancement that support the system. Also, it serves as rationalizing structure through state administration. And monotheism serves as the ideological value. It can morally legitimate the use of violence and the marginalization, discrimination, and even extinction of others based on ideological and religious categorization, like the heretics, the infidels, hypocrites, kafir, murtad, togut, munafik, dan lain-lain. Here, I think I can also mention the data that aside from the formal religions we have in Indonesia, now we acknowledge like 6 formal religions, we also have beliefs or what we call kepercayaan or kind of beliefs. And in the 1970s, there were about 600 organizations, but in 2017, there were only 140 organizations. This organization is being discriminated by the mainstream religious groups. I want to combine the 3 points from Laymert and my 3 points. 1, we are facing a new colonialism within a nation state, enforced by the dominant group through the use of military and modern technology and uncritical modern way of life, and in some cases supported by religion. 2, the breakaway from secular military regimes in the 80s to 90s opens possibility both of multiculturality, probably you don't like the, but it's kind of pluricultures as a bright side, as well as religious and ethnocentrism as the dark side. 3, there is a need to protect local spirituality from the substantial threat of monotheism. Why? Because the local spirituality contains the traditional logic that can be developed as alternative to post-colonial knowledge. This protection later on has to be followed by efforts to let this indigenous epistemology develop into an inclusive and emancipating knowledge system. Because we know that traditional or indigenous epistemologies are not necessarily emancipative, especially towards women, children, and the outcast. Back to the film, we saw a film about a ritual, and my first question is, where are the women? Where are the women? Probably, yeah, you can, because many of the local epistemologists say also are not very, not really give voices or bring emancipation to their women, children, minorities, and the outcasts. So I think this is what needs to be answered and developed into a more inclusive. As my own involvement with the emancipation projects, I would say that in the base of all colonialism is the colonialism by rationality towards what it pejoratively called irrationality. Let us not use the word irrationality, instead use for the time being non-rationality or the non-rational. Within this category is spirituality, which is derogated by rationalism as being superstitious. Indeed, some spiritual practices intersect with superstitions. But I still believe that the core of most of spiritual system has a coherence and rationality. And this core needs to and can be developed. I believe that it can be developed into a kind of critical spirituality. That is a kind of spirituality that is sourced from within authentic experiences of any particular community and be developed to be an open, inclusive, critical, and emancipative consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayu. Thank you. We will continue our discussion later about the points that she introduced to us or she put on the table. Now we are going to hear the response from Marco Kusumawijaya. Sorry, I changed your name. I should have a ritual of giving the red porridge. Kusumawijaya, sorry. Marco is an architect and urbanist. In the past 30 years, he has worked in various fields of architecture, arts, urban sustainability, and housing in various locations in Indonesia and also Southeast Asia. He's now working as a consultant in the Coastal Management Committee of Jakarta in Governor's Delivery Unit. Now he also has been involved in various projects. He was chair of Jakarta Arts Council before, and he has engaged in various exhibition and artist residence previously. Please, floor is yours.
Previously, I think there was an issue whether post-colonial study would still be relevant in the future in Southeast Asia. And I think Heinrich asked me the question last night and what I think. I said I could only reply in the perspective of urban studies. And actually, one of the topics that I picked up from Laymert is about urbanity, because he was saying something that there is a shift a post-colonial shift for the production of arts and culture from the city into the rural areas, into the interior, into the heart of our traditional cultures. The fact is, I think in most Southeast Asia, the experience of urbanity is actually the experience of modernity, and at the same time, the experience of coloniality. If you take the case of the Kingdom of Makassar, for example, the Goa, the king moved his capital, which in the description of Alfred Russel Wallace was simply a village, to the coast of South. Can I replace it? Because I don't want to hold this, but it's okay. So the Kingdom of Goa moved its capital to the coast of Makassar to confront the colonial power. And I think that started the city in, I think, early 17th centuries. And of course, it is very familiar for us who read, for example, Anthony Reid, The Age of Trade, that actually most of coastal cities, which are the only cities in Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia, are coastal. And their emergence are really because of, or happened in the time of 17th century. And that was the time we experienced the city as we knew it now. Of course, in Western sort of perspectives. So as an urbanist, I do actually get inspiration from studies on city, including those on the topics of colonial time and colonial issues. I think it is worth mentioning, actually, there are quite publications lately. I should mention one by Dr. Sulin Luis, very recently, the study of the port city in Southeast Asia between the 1920s and 1940. It is very rich. You can find the book, I think it's called Cities in Motion. I'm looking for it. Cities in Motion, Urban Life and Cosmopolitanism in Southeast Asia, 1920-1940. It was published only, I think, the second edition, which is revised at the end of last year. The book touches upon many interesting ideas, including the emergence of what she called the new womanhood in Southeast Asia port cities. And the port cities of Southeast Asia were rich then. It includes Rangoon, of course Singapore, Penang, but I think she didn't spend much time on Batavia. So I don't think Dr. Chua Beng Huat is right when he said that Singapore was the richest city in Southeast Asia then. You should compare it also with Surabaya. You know, Surabaya was very famous as a colonial town until the Second World War. So that's why Bertolt Brecht wrote a poem, a lyric, Surabaya Johnny, because Surabaya was famous and at the same time, of course, exotic. But Rangoon was very rich. Penang was very rich then. Bangkok, not to mention others. But the thing is, the production of urbanity of that time were fairly limited to, of course, Europeans and what in the Dutch word called Vreemde Oosterlingen, the Eastern strangers, as the second class in the colonial stratification after the Europeans, above the native, the pribumi. So, a nice way to describe how the urban spaces produced during this time was a description of a friend who was a dancer, actually a movement artist, Pak Suprapto Suryodarmo, who said once to us that when I was small, until my teenage time, I think he was born in 30s, now about 80s. He said, when I was young, for us, home is only our kampung. Please understand kampung as vernacular neighborhood. And outside our kampung is alien. We are alienated from it. We don't understand the structure of the space. He was talking about Solo, a city in central Java, where the production of urban space is a combination about colonial European space and at the same time, of course, the Sultan, the royal family spaces. Those are considered to be the city in the perspective of Europe, and at the same time, of course, what we have perceived for some time. The kampungs were hidden behind the two facades of the European spaces and the Eastern foreigners, the Arabs and the Chinese, and plus others. I think somebody yesterday mentioned about how our founding fathers were trying, or successful, I think Maneka said, in transcending the European powers in developing their ideas about Indonesia. And actually, this happened very much in kampung. One particular kampung is very important in Surabaya, which is called the Kampung of Peneleh. Kampung Peneleh is where we have the house of Dr. Cokro Aminoto, where most of our founding fathers stayed for some time, discussed a lot of issues during the 20s and the 30s. And I believe the idea of the Republic of Indonesia were born there. Even people from Sumatra and other islands, including Agus Salim, when they went to Java, they would go to Cokro Aminoto's house inside the kampung called Peneleh. We seldom heard about this kampung in the city. So my reaction to the shift of the city to a more locus which are more traditional in terms of cultural production, I think is happening now also, but not necessarily in the rural kampungs, in the rural vernacular neighborhoods, but also inside the city. And I think we have forgotten this for some time, and I think I'm happy enough and very, very glad to witness there are so many studies on kampung in the past 10 and 15 years. At the same time, when the comparative studies about colonial cities are also emerging, such as by Sulin Luis. Another study, for example, by Michel Coy, studied the technicality of water provision in the colonial time and described how as modernity it actually excludes people while at the same time trying to be a show of what modernity produced. Another interesting study on colonial vanity, but at the same time on post-colonial reflection about it, is by Rudolf Marachek. I'm not talking about the famous book Engineers in Happy Land, which is also at the same time very important book of looking at the technology and how technology shaped the colonial landscape. But his other book called A Certain Age, where he wrote his interviews with very old dying intellectuals in the 90s who remember, and about how they remember colonial time and how they project their memories and their reflections about what the future of Indonesia should be. And I think it is, again, a very rich study. So that's one point about the city, which I completely took provoked by your paper. The second theme that I was provoked about by your paper is about, kampung, I think I have described enough, but the third thing is about the impact on landscape. I think this is also something in Southeast Asian, you know, I really think not only about Indonesia, the study of the impact of colonialism on our environment, on our landscape, and how the colonial exploitation of resources have created what Nancy Lee Peluso called racialized landscape. So there is a sort of post-colonial perspective study on this. Nancy Lee Peluso wrote a book about Borneo. I think the book title is actually Racialized Landscape, showing how before the Dutch imposed their rules of segregation, Chinese, the indigenous Dayak of Borneo worked together in their farms, intermarried, and it is so visible in the landscape. But after the Dutch imposed their laws, segregation took place. Of course, ethnically and racially, it's also very confusing because there has been so much intermarriage before. So people are confused, am I Chinese or am I Dayak, the indigenous community? And also then, after a few years, it manifests itself in the landscape. You can see the landscape, the gardens of the Chinese and the gardens of the Dayak and the gardens of the Malay, another ethnic group in the terminology of the colonial time, different. Yeah? And some Indonesians might remember how the differences in landscape and the different groupings of ethnic groups in Borneo turned into violent conflict in the 90s and also in the 2000s. So actually, the other book by Nancy Lee Peluso is titled Violent Environment. But she really meant it is not the environment which is violent to human, but it is how the different communities became violent in the environment that have been racialized for some time. She is now studying the eastern part of Java, especially about areas surrounding Jember, where you have state-owned forestry companies. She is investigating the emergence of laws on forestry from the colonial time, which is, of course, very racialized, and etc. And, of course, supposed to ease the colonial exploitation of the forest. And I think we should draw from this to understand what happened now to also our current situation of the exploitation of our environment in Borneo, in Papua, and also actually still in East Java, West Java, and perhaps also in Sulawesi. How exploitation of resources have created a lot of conflict, a lot of violence in Nancy Lee Peluso words. So that's my kind of overview, trying to say that there are actually post-colonial studies about Southeast Asia. Nancy is not working only on Indonesia, but she is now, for example, what she is doing about the forestry is in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. Whether these studies will be relevant in the future, I think it depends on how we use it to enlighten us on our current issues and also to use them as a torch to light our way into the future. Thank you.
Responding to some key issues that have been introduced. One issue probably we should talk more about authenticity. You mentioned about authentic experience and how maybe you can respond and discuss about that. Another thing that is interesting in connection to the three presentation is how to make the unseen visible. Make the unseen visible in Ayu's is what she said to be traditional epistemologies, etc. And what is unseen in Marco's presentation is the kampung culture, which is now undergoing a sort of a lot of revival, like what you mentioned in your presentation, the excitement of engaging and reinventing their own culture, which is not going back to the past, but making use of what is there, engaging with what is high, low, you know, whatever, and trying to create something distinctive. So maybe that, and also maybe you have other things to comment, to respond back to them.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Ayu and to Marco for the issues you developed, and I'm very glad because I've seen that there are points that really resonate between our experiences, I would say, because I like very much the idea of starting with from our experiences, and in this sense, it was I think Ayu, for instance, touched a point which is for me extremely important in the way of valuing traditional knowledge. This way of valuing, when you pointed out the importance of to develop something that does not exist, critical spirituality, I would say. Starting with traditional knowledge in order to develop something that is lacking and that Western knowledge cannot bring about any longer. So I think this is very important, and in the Brazilian case, it is very important in order to well, first of all, not to mimic only Western way of thinking, but to rely on our own resources in the future, not in the past. And this, I think, is very important because when we look, we have to change, to start changing the way we look at traditional knowledge. And I think that with the cybernetic turn from the 70s on, this is much more possible than it was before in modern times. In contemporary times, it's much more, it's easier to do that because the cybernetic turn erased the relationship between, or the opposition between modern and traditional knowledge, because all those, including modern, have become traditional in a certain sense, and the distinction between modern and tradition has been overcome, because from the cybernetic perspective we are in a different level or in a different paradigm. No? So all these old oppositions that were very based on prejudice, in fact, nowadays are over. They do not make sense anymore. And in this sense, I think that's why I chose the example of our film, because the discussion between different cosmologies, different epistemologies, and so on, cannot rely any longer on those prejudices that there are some are superior over others. And this is when you say, I think that we should not turn back, but take different epistemologies and look after for the development of a critical spirituality. I think this is a very, very important point. And mainly because this is for you is understood as an emancipative knowledge. And so the perspective of a critical spirituality, it's not I like very much the way you bring a distinction between religion as we commonly think of and the kind of, I would say, the kind of perspective that you open when you talk about emancipative knowledge system built in a critical spirituality perspective, including critical spirituality perspective. This is, I think it's very much important. I think this is a contribution that you give for us. For me, it is very important because it is not something that I had thought of, and I think it is, at least for as far as I know a little bit of Oriental thinking, this is something that could come from the East, but could not come from the West, and I would say not even from Brazilian perspective, I would say, because we are, in a certain sense, we are a little far away from this. So I'm very grateful for you for this contribution concerning where are the women. This is a point somehow difficult. I know that there are in this group, Yanomami group, that there are shamans, women, female shamans. But I've been working with them for, well, at least 10 years, and I never met one shaman, a female shaman. So in our film, when you ask where are the women, I would say that in shamanism, as far as I've seen and experienced, women were behind the scenes. Women play a very singular role in Yanomami society. It is a warriors society, so it's of course based mainly on the presence of the prestige of men. But women are behind. In fact, they drive men towards the direction they really want to. Because when a Yanomami gets married, he goes living with the family of his wife. So he is, in fact, under the influence of his wife's family. He has to pay duties and so on to this family, and at the same time, the influence of what women have to say concerning every aspect of Yanomami life has to be considered. So it's a kind of very discreet or very hidden position where women are, but at the same time they are not, I would say that there is not a second role. Of course in public it seems that men are much more important because they are warriors, but at the same time there is this kind of singularity concerning this this ethnic group. With Marco, in my speech, I gave more importance to this going to inside and going to looking after these groups that were excluded, that were out of the stage, out of stage. And if we think that 13% of Brazilian huge territory, which is a continental country, is rainforest that belongs to indigenous peoples. We have a good slice of a Brazilian country that is indigenous. So they were not important in terms of a Brazilian population as a whole, or cultural influence and so on. But they have become, since the environmental crisis, a key group, because their territories are the most preserved in Brazil, and this means 13% of territory in which resources are very much intact. So when they start being valued nationally and internationally, because this has become a global issue, Amazonas has become a global issue. That's why I privilege this, this looking at rural areas. But I would say that the perspective, for instance, during the democratic governments, that the people from the outskirts, the excluded people from the periphery of big cities were also considered, and their culture started to be considered, which had never been the case. So it is important to see, for instance, concerning the favelas and so on, how this kind of expression that expressions that are produced in the neighborhoods are being also revalued. When you talk about the landscape issue, this reminds me something that is a very astonishing. Brazilians, since the colonial times, since the 16th century, always considered Amazonia as a region that was not, had no population. It was the void. So we had, since the beginning up to almost to the end of the 20th century, it was a territory that was had to be occupied in colonial, according to a colonial logic, no? But when studies started in relationship to archaeological studies started, they, for instance, discovered that not only Amazonia had been inhabited for centuries and centuries, but also that the forest was not in huge parts of Amazonia, the forest was not natural. It was a garden. And they started discovering that what in all regions where you find what they call black land, or black soil, in fact, not black land, black soil, these soils had been produced by centuries of occupation of indigenous peoples. I've seen this when I crossed the river called River Negro in Amazonia, and you can see on the borders, on the margins of the river, you can see parts of ceramics that are, in fact, archaeological artifacts, and showing that these so-called black soil was produced, in fact. And in fact, we know very little about important parts of what is happening in the landscape, including the landscape. So and we didn't know how to read this. If you start considering this change of perspective, that the Amazonia, part of Amazonia is a garden, a huge garden, then you start understanding also not only that the colonial, the colonial view of non-occupation and so on does not stand. So I think it is this kind of changing of how to read the landscape, and how can we discover that through traditional knowledge. It's much better to know the importance of this. But if you don't know that, you are not able to recognize this. Well, I think these are the 2 points that, I'm very glad that all this resonated with my talk. And well, thank you.
Thank you. Now we will open the floor to the audience. Do we still have time? We still have time. Okay. Please raise your question. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. 4 questions. Please.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Tagar. I'm particularly interested by the claim made by Laymert. I don't know if it's your claim or you're simply quoting other source about the fact that indigenous wisdom is no inferior to rationality. How is it no inferior, and which standard are you using to base that claim on? And in terms of what is it no inferior? In terms of utility, for the number of goods that it brings to the community, for example, I'd like to know. And is this view shared by the community or by the country, by Brazil, for example? And do the governments also agree with this such a viewpoint? And or maybe other countries in South America happen to propose the same wisdom. And this also, the response given by Ayu is also interesting, in which she said that indigenous knowledge and tradition is not necessarily emancipatory, because we can see that sometimes they can be really discriminatory towards other marginalized groups, such as women and the other outcasts of the society. And for which she proposes a critical spirituality. But what strikes me the most is it seems to me that the individuality in critical spirituality, it sounds more like a semantic exercise and just like a reinvention of liberalism, actually. So I don't think that there's something new. So please correct me if I'm wrong, and by explaining more by what you mean by critical spirituality. And lastly, this is probably my question for both of you. What would you reply to somebody who adopt a logic, a Nietzschean logic, in which all attempts at redefining epistemology, this creation of Southern epistemology, is just a typical Alice slave morality, Nietzschean logic, in which we cannot accept that the other, in this case, the modernist, technocratic, rational viewpoint is in fact superior. Thank you.
Okay. Shall we collect the questions? Or is it you want to answer right away? Yeah? You want to answer that?
Well, concerning this issue of inferiority in or superiority in epistemological terms. Of course, it's very difficult. I can only talk about that in my experience with the indigenous peoples, mainly with the Yanomami people. It is the first step is to see. Well, of course, you have to learn a little bit about this without prejudice. This what cosmology, their cosmology is, and the way they learn and the way they think, or their mode of existence. For me, the starting point to erase this asymmetry is to start thinking that it's stupid to think that we developed intellectually and they got stuck in the prehistorical time, as if you cannot develop in a different direction. So for me, the Yanomami are not people of the Stone Age. They are people that chose to develop in a different direction. And we think that they are, well, anachronistic, because we don't understand what they developed, in fact. And we don't have instruments to realize what they are doing, what they developed intellectually, and also in terms of their own technology, which is very difficult for us to get rid of this perspective, no? For me, for my experience, it was important during all this period of the opera and of the film to discover that I had to get rid of this asymmetry. For instance, we brought some shamans, including one of them two of them that appear in the film, to ZKM Center of Art and Technology, the most important center of art and technology in Europe, which was collaborating with us and working on the part of the opera related to techno-scientific perspective on deforestation in Amazonia. They are dealing with data, technological data, with techno-scientific information, analysis, procedures, diagrams, and so on. And, well, it's a scientific production on the deforestation. And Peter Weibel, the director of ZKM, invited the shamans to come with us to Karlsruhe. And at ZKM, they have a kind of museum of art and technology, very, very special in the sense that they have samples of works of art and technology in various expressions and digital devices and so on. We visited all this with the shamans, with an anthropologist that was translating, a guided visit with an anthropologist that was translating in Yanomami everything that was said about all those works by the director of ZKM. And by the end, when the tour was finishing, I saw that one shaman had made a comment with the anthropologist. And I asked, what did he say? He said, and he had said, white people are like children. They love little games. That was his point of view concerning the works of art that he had seen. I listened to this and kept this in mind. And when we finished with the opera was done, concluded and presented in Munich in 2010, we brought again the shamans to see the opera. And when the day after, we had lunch together, and a critic of music from Hamburg that had visited the Yanomami village because he did not believe the kind of work that we were doing, so he wanted to see in the place itself what was going on and so on. He came from Hamburg to Munich to see the opera, and the day after we had lunch, and he asked the shaman, well, now that you have seen the product, the opera, the presentation of the performance and so on, what do you think about it? And he very gently said, well, I would say that first of all, it's very important for you to have done this opera. It's important for us in diplomatic and political terms, because for us it is important to engage a relationship with white people in high level. We normally are used to be in contact with very ignorant and poor workers that invade the forest for logging, for gold, for resources and so on. And we never have the possibility to have an exchange, as was the case in the opera, to discuss with educated people concerning our point of view of the opera. And also we think that a product like an opera is very important to help us defend our territory. Yeah, because you can see, and white people can understand why it's so, the maintaining of the rainforest is so important for us. But I would add, he said, something, and this something was astonished us. He said, this is, you know, we shamans, we don't need to explain everything. I think that your art is, he related to shamanism in a way that we understood immediately, that he considered that it was childish, the way we had presented the problematics in our terms. And he considered it was childish, and this I linked immediately with what the other shaman had said when we visited the ZKM museum, because it was in the same perspective. And I was very, thank you, I was very, well, surprised, because from which point of view can he consider that we are childish when we make art? And perhaps it is because, well, the easy answer could say, we could say, well, he didn't understand anything, so he dismissed it. But perhaps it's not the case. Perhaps comparing to what the travel they make in the spiritual worlds and in what we call virtual worlds and so on, perhaps it's so developed that, and we cannot understand, So I think this is the way well, to be more humble and we don't know, in fact, and since we don't know, I think it's stupid to destroy before not knowing, at least, even in an egocentric perspective. We should think that things are disappearing, important knowledges are disappearing, and we don't know, we don't even know what they are about. And that's, for me, the point. I give it to you.
Thank you. I try to be concise. I think I will answer only 2 questions. I don't want to answer about the Nietzsche. I give it to Marco. It's too long. Slave morality, Nietzschean slave morality. Okay, the first question is, I think, the indigenous or local or traditional knowledge are not necessarily emancipative. I think we can see easily in the case of Kartini. Yeah, in Kartini, she experienced that it is the Western education that liberate or emancipate women, and she explained, or what she felt is that the tradition, the Javanese tradition, is really secluding their women. Yeah, that's Kartini's experience. But actually, we can learn from Peter Carey. He was here yesterday, based on his reading on Diponegoro's manuscript and text. He showed us that before the Java War, actually Javanese women had big roles. So the domestication of women only happened after the end of Java War, in which the Dutch domesticate the Javanese men, and then the Javanese aristocracy men and the Javanese men in the aristocracy circle, they domesticate the women. What I want to say is, you cannot be essentialist. We cannot make a difference between Western or non-Western, East or traditional. The potential to suppress or to liberate is in any particularity. I mean, so I think emancipation is not a situation, it is a moment. You will face with different kind of situation that you need to break. And it will happen all the time. Be it West or East or local or universal, but you will, so it's not based on identity or essential. We cannot be essentialist. The critical spirituality, of course, I don't care if it is new or not. I don't think there's something new under the world, under the sky. But what I want to do with this term, I introduced this term like 10 years ago with my book, Bilangan Fu. But actually, there is, to make it short, I'm doing some research on the concept of rasa. Rasa is actually a Sanskrit word, but it developed in the Javanese spirituality in a different way. And I found out that it developed in Javanese during the Islamic period. So it was not developed into a kind of spiritual concept. It is an aesthetic concept within the Hindu tradition. But it became a very spiritual concept in Java in the time of Islam, in the 17th century. And my speculation is that it is developed because there is a conflict between the Orthodox and the spiritual and the Sufi. And the Sufi group used this, they developed this concept, or they used this name, this word, to develop what a mechanism that actually had been there in the archipelago, a mechanism to unite, to syncretize. And this mechanism had been there even before, but in the 17th century, they name it as rasa. And I like to explain things in a simple way, hopefully without making without any oversimplification, but I want to differentiate between the mechanism of rasa and the mechanism of reason. With the mechanism of rasa, actually the mechanism of reason works based on making lines. You categorize, you identify, you define, so you're making lines. Sometimes you're making open lines, but can be you make a closed lines. Rasa works in a very different way. It unites, it goes together, so it is without demarcation. And I think this mechanism had been there in this archipelago. Probably it is also universal, but since I think my job is to dig from our experience, I'm sure that it had been there from the very, very old time, and you can see it work in different manifestation, including in the manifestation of the Sutasoma with Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, with Pancasila and others. You see that it worked. Sometimes with names, sometimes without names. Yeah, I think.
I think we should collect now the other questions. There were. Please give the microphone. And then the third one. This one. Oh, this one. 3, and then 2. Yeah, you, and then you're number 3, and then number 4. Yes. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Rio. I study international relations in Universitas Diponegoro, Semarang. There are some interesting concepts that has been talked between Mr. Laymert's speech and Mr. Marco's reaction, answers to it, and that is the connection between urbanism and the local cultures and the colonialism and such on. It makes me think that in a sense of human geography, does this urbanist movement or urban emergence during colonial times, post-colonial times, or during what Mr. Laymert called the dictatorship, does it actually alienated this culture, this local people, these local traditions, at the point they are become so different, they are become so alienated to the rest of the urban areas, because there are also kampungs inside a big city that has really different values. They are alienated inside a big city. So is that what are your opinions in this? Does this alienation is true? It's happened. It's a phenomenon, or it is not? Also, to Ms. Ayu Utami, this is a bit off topic, but it's still related because you mentioned about women in culture. It makes me think a bit. There is a dilemma in which what are we striving for? Are we trying to protect this culture, preserve this culture in the purest form where the value are intact? Meanwhile, we are very familiar that some of the culture we know have patriarchal values in it. But then again, if we want to infuse our modern thinking into this culture while preserving it, the value might be gone. And I don't want to say this, but after we develop this some certain culture into a modern value, it just become empty. It become valueless, and at the highest point, it's just become a commodity, a commodification of culture. It has lost its value. What are your opinions on this? Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Thank you. I'm Dian. I would like to ask Laymert's experience about maybe in Indonesia and Brazil, we share a lot of things related to indigenous peoples. And what about the indigenous peoples movement in politics? Because we are facing our moment now. It's our political years, and Indonesia already ratified UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but until now we haven't specific laws on the protection of indigenous peoples here. So now so many indigenous peoples, activists, and also indigenous peoples themselves trying to what we call it, trying to participate themselves in the electoral system here. But I think in the other hands, our characteristic or our system here, we are now adopt such a liberal democracy system, like one vote, one person. But in the other hands, we see like the character of indigenous peoples. They have what we call a deliberative democracy. So what about in Brazil experience? Maybe we assume that if indigenous peoples themselves sit there in parliament or in the executive, then can change the public policy here. Maybe there is no criminalization against indigenous peoples, and also because land grabbing still happen here related to indigenous territory. So thank you.
Okay. So you want two only for now? For now, yeah. I think two is enough first. Otherwise, they will forget. Okay.
I think the question for me is the relationship between urbanism and local culture. I think you drew the right conclusion that I actually also want to draw. Insofar as the way we produce urban spaces is only a reproduction of the colonial way, the kampungs will remain alienated. And that's, I think, what we have seen a lot. When I told you the story of my conversation with Suprapto, he actually continues saying that after the independence, I felt it still very hard to see the space outside my kampung as my space. And now meaning a few years ago, we are seeing the same space are being produced while at the same time alienating our indigenous or our vernacular neighborhoods. And this is, as you know, is happening quite actually brutally. Yeah, kampungs are being erased. In some cases, kampungs are being enclosed, and some kampung could not have an access towards the space outside the post-colonial facade. Yeah, but this is the thing why it is important to investigate the kampung. My reaction to Laymert is not to say that it is not important to look into the rural areas, into the heart of the land, which is often in many cultures also the heart of our cultures. Because I think in some part of the world we believe that cultures flow from the rural areas to the city. But I just want to emphasize that we are also, apart from losing our cultures in the heart of our land, we also are losing our culture inside the cities because we simply are reproducing post-colonial structured space. Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? I actually agree with your conclusion. You concluded better and you described it better than I did.
Well, concerning the value of traditional knowledge and culture in modern times, I would answer your question with something that happened to me recently that really surprised me. In the 20s, modernity in visual arts and in literature, in visual arts, in theater and so on, started in Brazil, in São Paulo in 1922, because there was a big event in São Paulo which started modernity in the arts. And in that case, there were two main issues that appeared in this modern movement or modern art in Brazil. One of them was a book, a novel, wrote by a Brazilian mestizo, black and white. And this Brazilian mestizo wrote a book called Macunaíma. And this book was relied on a character that Mário de Andrade picked in narratives, anthropological narratives, ethnological narratives that had been made by a German explorer in the north of, in Amazonia, in the north of Brazil. Because in traditional knowledge, there existed a character called Macunaíma, in North Macunaíma, which was and the fact is that this book became very important, a very important reference in Brazilian modern culture, because Macunaíma has been considered since then as the Brazilian hero. I mean, even not a Brazilian hero, but Brazilian hero and anti-hero, because it was a satirical book. It was considered that Brazilian character was not having a character. And so this was Macunaíma. This was the first big point that was raised by modernism in Brazil. We Brazilians are like Macunaíma. And we have no character because our character is having no character. The second one was anthropophagy, because some ethnic groups in Brazil had been cannibals. And these had been studied since the 17th century by travelers, explorers, and so on. And they described very well the techniques, how mainly the Tupinambá had eaten Europeans, and how they have eaten them, according to which kind of beliefs and knowledge and incorporation, embodiment of power, and so on. And in the same period, 1922, a poet-writer called Oswald de Andrade said, we have to deal with European culture as the Tupinambá. We have to eat this, their culture, digest it, and absorb their power in our own perspective. Well, it's okay. Since then, anthropophagy and Macunaíma are modernity in Brazil cannot be understood without those two reference points. 2 years ago, Goethe-Institut in São Paulo organized a discussion with Indigenous artists from different parts of Brazil, with some curators, Brazilian curators and South American curators, in order to discuss what is going on with indigenous art, because indigenous art is entering the stage, and how indigenous artists are dealing with this new situation and so on. Are their production seen according to tradition or not? Have they been considered as artists or not? Why are they not artists, and so on? And in that occasion, two indigenous artists introduced the issue again. One of them, which belonged to the same ethnic group of Macunaíma, said, we want to get Macunaíma back again to us, because it belongs to us, and it was appropriated by Marachek, the Brazilian writer. So we want to reappropriate what was appropriated. And the other indigenous artist said, we want the same with cannibalism. We want to cannibalize your art, your culture, and take it to our own perspective. And suddenly, a kind of short circuit happened in my mind, because what they were doing was to revindicate the two pillars of modern art in Brazil, saying your two most important pillars of modern art in Brazil belong to us, and we want those pillars back. It was amazing, because in epistemological terms, what was happening in this discussion at Goethe-Institut São Paulo was absolutely unexpected. And at the same time, then the second artist, which was revendicating the reappropriation of cannibalism, showed me a painting, because he's a painter, showed me a painter in which he painted the Last Supper by Michelangelo in a Western Italian way, being devoured by the rainforest. And so you had this kind of contrast and tension between the Last Supper of the prophets are being, the apostles are being erased or being dismantling or disappearing, and being devoured by the huge wild force that is coming in and taking all this scene, this Last Supper. Very good painting. He knew the techniques, and the curator of Pinacoteca de São Paulo have also seen this painting, and he said he could not have painted this without Cézanne. And so this artist really knew painting, how to paint it, and he had reappropriated all this through his painting. I think this is a very important, for me it's very important that this has happened in the art system. And it's important because this obliges Brazilians to consider how they appropriated indigenous peoples, not only values, but also knowledge and thinking and concepts and so on, and how now we have indigenous artists getting back again this in a very critical way. I think this is, for me, the point of the value of tradition and modernity and how they can be related.
Yeah, I'm not a cultural conservationist, and I don't believe in anything pure, but I believe in a process of purification. And this process of purification is emancipation. So it's a process to emancipate from different forms of traps, imprisonment, including emancipation from commodification. But, for example, you know, the situation is always complex in reality. Like, I came from a Javanese family, and Javanese will be a kind of representation of traditionality, the tradition, and Indonesia is the modern. And for me, to have an Indonesian language is an emancipation from the feudalistic Javanese language that my family or my mother and father have. So I think it's also happened to Pramudia Anantatur. To be Indonesia is a liberation from that tradition. But after sometimes we also know that there are some important aspects from the tradition or the tradition, and for me it is the concept of from this tradition I can dig some concepts to again in the process of emancipation from the modern trap. What I mean by modern trap here is a mechanism of reason in which you are, with modern education, we are taught to understand only when we can define things. We don't know how to understand without definition, and that's a danger, I think. We need a balance. So yeah, that's my question. I think Laymert and all of us will be agree in a position that none of the reason compared to non-reason are superior. We need both, and none of the culture or tradition is superior than other. The Western rationality is not superior compared to the indigenous epistemology. Each of this culture is a particularity, and what we want to have is a trans-particularity.
Thank you. My name is Ari. I'm interested in the point raised concerning the shifting sites of cultural production, or more specifically, perhaps artistic production. This question came to my mind immediately when Laymert said that in Brazil there's a Minister of Culture.
Closer. Microphone closer, please.
Ministry of Culture. While in Indonesia, culture has shifted from one ministry to another. Once it was grouped with education, then it moved to tourism, and then now back to education, but only on the national level, because on the provincial and the city levels, culture and art is still grouped with tourism. So in listening to your presentation, that confuses me in trying to place where culture is produced and by whom and by whose authority. Which authority, let's say, validates something as being of cultural or artistic value, or more importantly, who gets funding. I think that's the most important issue, who gets funding and who gets to decide who gets funding. The other shifting is when Marco talked about the existence of kampungs within the city, and I was involved in a project by a performance art collective which explores the movement of people who had lived in kampung and had been displaced and moved into vertical housing. And the project helped give agency to the displaced to continuously produce culture and art, although of course with a different landscape they will of course produce a different kind of culture and different kind of art. So my question is, with the shifting of sites of cultural production and artistic production, and the realization that there are different alternative ways of knowing, my question is, how do we put that into everyday practice whether this has something to do with the shifting of the place of culture within the ministries. Do we put that into practice through, let's say, secondary education, tertiary education, elementary education, through arts programs, through novels, the reading of novels, or how is our appreciation of the existence and the presence and the significance of alternative ways of knowing, alternative epistemologies, how do we put it into everyday practice? Not something, and I think this is important because we need to ensure that those alternative ways of knowing do not remain a mere part of a fiction. This is a bit cynical of Ayu. Or it becomes a mere spectacle of our modernist gaze, as Bu Melani has warned us in the introduction of this session. Thank you.
Okay, on the final one, there are two. Okay, two final comments.
Kepada Mbak Ayu Utami, yang saya permasalahkan, nama saya Ridwan dari Depok. Yang permasalahkan hari ini kan nasionalisme ini merupakan warisan. Padahal pada era pergerakan kan nasionalisme adalah sebuah warisan masa depan. Bahkan dalam lagu Indonesia Raya disebutkan di sanalah kita berdiri, bukan di sini. Nah, apakah bisa nasionalisme ini menjadi proyek masa depan atau cuma sebagai warisan?
I wanted to express some doubts about the way in which reason, modernity, monotheism, just to use the 3 points that were raised by Ayu, but also the relationship to an authentic indigenous culture, for instance, shamanism, which was expressed by Laymert. What really will be our relationship to it? I want to go back to the first question that was asked, which was the question about standards, and this is how I see it. To begin with monotheism, yes, we acknowledge that in the guise or through monotheism, much damage was done to other cultures and other religions. But what about polytheism? And what we find in the case of Hinduism today in India is that it is itself devouring various other local cultures and local gods and goddesses. And so I don't think polytheism is so innocent. So, you know, again, this could turn into a false standard. Secondly, when it comes to protecting the ethno side of indigenous cultures, which are much weaker in economic and political terms against colonialism, but even against other forms of colonialism within a country. Caste system in India, which is a birth-based discriminatory racist system, which has been practicing untouchability for a long time, is also an indigenous form. Do we want to protect it? And this is where the question of standards brings us back to recognize that we are modern because we are confronted with certain choices. And of course, there are certain older standards which we'll have to scrutinize and they will not help us. But we cannot back away from the choices that we will have to make, and we will have to take responsibility for that. And in that regard, I wanted to just make a caution about modernity because the rasa theory, to the little extent I know about it as practiced in certain forms of art, music on the subcontinent, for instance, Hindustani classical music, definitely they do categorize. So I'm also a bit worried about this broad idea that only the colonizers create knowledge based on categorization, on division and definition. In fact, for me, it's hard to imagine any knowledge which does not produce demarcations. The opposite of that could be a kind of mysticism. But again, what kind of politics are we really imagining on the basis of that kind of a non-dual or mystic union where nothing is defined? That's another question. And so this confrontation about our own position today, what paths we will choose and what decisions we will make, would we, besides protecting certain groups, how many of us would actually envisage joining a group which is headed by shamans or by Brahmin priests on the subcontinent or by other such? So if we look around us in this hall, we are actually immersed in modernity. So I think we have to be also very honest about what it is that we are asking for. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, nationalism is a heritage nowadays, while in the past it was a future. Can nationalism be a future? Terima kasih. Saya kira memang kita harus ganti lagu Indonesia Rasa di sinilah kita berada. But yeah, also commenting to Aryo Gaswara. Well, Indonesia is a fiction made real. So I think it's a fiction, it's a heritage, but we can make real now and in the future. I think it's clear. And I think for me, the way we want to make it stay or make it real in the future is, again, for me, the measurement is whether each individual is emancipated or has the biggest choice for each one. I think that's what I want to fight for. Divya, thank you for the question. Yeah, that's why I said that I wrote this triple unholy trinity: modernity, monotheism, and militarism. It was from 10 years ago, before the Hindu chauvinistic came into the stage. But I think polytheism, I don't think you will use, or I think polytheism is a category that is used by the monotheists to call others. It's not a name that the Hindu or the animists will call themselves. I don't know whether they will call themselves polytheists. After. They are persecuting Muslims and Christians and killing them by saying these are bad. But it's after the modern time, right? I mean, in the past, I don't know. No, but just a small thing that this is not a phenomenon of 10 years ago. It has its rise in early 20th century. This is what I know. But I said it is before the phenomena of Hindu chauvinism came into the international news, because I don't know what happened in India. You know that, but I don't. I mean, of course you know, but I don't know what happened in India before it came into the international news. So when I wrote this, I didn't hear much things about the. So I mean, you have to see it from the information I have in Indonesia. I'm only speaking about today and this conversation, not because I haven't read your book 10 years ago. No, I mean, that's why I just want to, okay. But it's not, but I think what I want to speak is the Indonesian, especially the Indonesian situation, in which I think monotheism is very, very dominant, and they want to change or to convert other system of thinking into their own. Like the Hindu in Bali, they have to also at schools, they have to find a shloka or a religious text that shows that there is the highest one God. So this is the Indonesian situation, yeah. And usually, modernity is not, monotheism is not considered part of modernity or rationality. But what I want to say is that they really apply the same methods, especially compared to the mystics or compared to the local or spirituality, which is categorizing. But when I criticize this mechanism of categorization, it doesn't mean that I want to be like the mystic, non-duality, because what I want to say is none from the categorizing or non-categorizing is superior than others. What we need now is the dialogue between form and the formless, the dialogue between this mechanism of categorization and the others. And I think this is more important knowing the case of the rise of anti-LGBT movement in Indonesia. Now, this years is, I think, the worst situation of anti-LGBT in Indonesia. While in the past, we don't categorize. We just accept that people practicing different sexual practices, and it is not related to any identity. We know that probably some guy, they have a family and they also have a relation with men. We don't categorize them. We don't categorize. So it's not based on identity, but we lose this. The LGBT movement, emancipation movement, are copying the West, which using the identification, categorization, this mechanism, and it is adopted here, and it creates another a reaction from the religious group. Then we are on a new level of different style of categorization, but we lost what we used to have, which is fluidity. Oh, another question, the rasa in India, yeah. I don't talk about rasa in Indian aesthetic, yeah. That's why I underline that this is the rasa the Javanese developed in the 17th century.
Okay, Marco, maybe you, and then final
think I have
from Laymert.
Just one question from the gentleman next to Maneke. I don't know his name, so I mentioned it to attract your attention to your own question. Your question is how to put into practice the emerging new ways and loci of cultural production. That is it? In our everyday life, yes. Very short answer is just practice it. But there are a lot to it now, I think. I can see here there are a lot of curators, cultural study centers, people, artists are doing a lot of work within this new or emerging cultural and artistic space in communities, in kampung, whether in the city or outside the city. My own urban study center do a lot of works with communities in Jakarta and other places in Indonesia. We also have a facility actually in Yogyakarta where we have artists in residency programs with very simple two requests, that they work with the communities in the surrounding area and they work on environmental issues. Now, I need to mention why kampung is important, for example. Take the famous example that now everybody must know, the kampung aquarium that have been evicted. Now they are rebuilding their life. There are, I think, what about 88 families remaining there in their temporary shelters. Do you know how many languages are spoken there? 7. They speak Batak. There are families speaking Batak, Bugis, Minang, Sundanese, and Javanese, Betawi Malay, of course, and Bahasa Indonesia, of course. And there is one midget, yeah? If talking about pluralism or diversity. There is one midget, but I have no idea whether there is LGBT or not, because that's something that is not too easy to reveal. So a lot of plurality, a lot of diversity in Kampung. But more important than the locus itself in terms of space, I think it is important we speak about locus in terms of community, because I think there are many critiques toward the state and there are many critiques toward the market. But what we are missing is critique towards our own desire. And in community, it is very obvious that you have to critique also your own self, especially your desire, when there's a real sense of community where the keyword would be commons. So the process of commoning is an important process within the current experiment in practicing arts and other cultural productions in these new spaces, in kampung, in communities all over the world, I think. I'm sure this resonates a lot in Latin America, even in Spain, in Southeast Asia, actually also in East Asia. So just practice it. There are a lot of communities doing it now, a lot of artists, a lot of curators, a lot of cultural study centers, a lot of urban study centers doing it. But the key would be experiment more with the process of commoning and experiment more with critics toward three big things. Critics toward the state, critics towards the market, and critics towards our desire. The reason why this is emerging is because there is this environmental urgency. The environmental urgency really urges us, I think, to think about the way we consume and the way we produce. And that's why commoning and the critique of desire is important. That is something we have been avoiding for so much. We are very keen at criticizing the state, the market, but we forget that actually the state and the market, I could say, are the produce of our desire.
Well, the question, who gets funding? Well, nowadays no one, but in Brazil. But for the experience I was referring to, which was of popular government, democratic government, there was a kind of a very important move, improvement of education. And at the same time, which was worked out in parallel and in relationship to the Ministry of Culture. But there is a difference, anyway, because tourism and education, I think even tourism also requires transmission of knowledge and how to deal with the environment and how to educate people in order to make things sustainable and so on. So it has to do with tourism and education, have to do with learning, I would say. But culture has to do with creation, invention, experimentation. And what happened in Brazil was, even if the Ministry of Education was very much related to the Ministry of Culture, they knew how to separate, and even in terms of funding. In Brazil, we had already the instruments in terms of law to channel funds from the state to the improvement of culture. But these were very much, or almost absolutely appropriated by the private sector. in order to promote, commodification of culture, in fact, entertainment, and so on. And what happened was, with this new direction, and there was a big fight, of course, because all the show business and so on were very much angry with the Ministry of the Minister of Culture, because what he did was, and I tried to explain during my talk, was to identify spots of not of only of demand of culture, but spots where there were potentials of cultural production that could be improved through injection of infrastructure, space for young people, and opportunity to experiment. So what changed, the perspective that changed, it was that we don't look only to the lack of culture. We look mainly to what are the potentials in different places that can be improved if we recognize this value. And this is what happened, and was absolutely, conservatives hated this idea because they thought that this money should not go to in this direction. And so that's why I said that it was channeled differently towards the countryside and to small villages and to marginalized groups and so on. Because before, all the money went to São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, and that's all, and for the commercial production of culture, commodification of culture, in fact. So this was the who got the funds, who got funding, was this recognition that culture was a matter, politics on culture was a matter of public duty, and not to be given only to the market to decide, and not also to consider that the state's role was uniquely to provide funds for people who were already in the recognized circuit of commodification of culture. The issue of, I think the most important thing was this, instead of starting with what is lacking, we start with what we have already, that there can be the potentials we have. So it's an affirmative policy. Concerning your point on I agree with you that there is an issue of protecting the indigenous peoples of ethnocide, etc. But what is our position in, like modern people, in this whole thing? And I tend to agree with Ayu in a very strong way, because what is important for me, more than being modern or not modern and so on, including for the indigenous people, what is important is becoming. And what, not being, but becoming. And in this perspective, what is important is to consider that we have to fight for the possibility of indigenous peoples continue or not their own becoming. As well as we have to fight for the opening of our becoming, and which our becoming does not imply necessarily that we have to stay modern. This does not mean that we have to go back to become Indians, for instance. No, at all. But we have to have the possibility, as she said, to become. And so including and nailing the spiritual sense. So I think this is this opportunity. I think modernity only does not allow us to become, and that's why I insisted a lot in my talk that there is not only one contemporaneity. There are many contemporaries. All of us are contemporary in a certain sense, and we have to recognize that becoming is related to this multiple contemporaneity.
Wow. Okay, I think we should continue with the second round later next year. Goethe-Institut has provided the connection. We should grab it, yeah, make it ours. So why don't we continue connecting with one another in so many other ways? Thank you so much. Please give us a round of applause. Wonderful. Wow. Thank you. Exciting.